The days passed very slowly leading up to our departure for the Autumn Palace, though on the day itself it seemed to me that for all of that, I was not prepared. For weeks we had set ourselves to the business of packing the Empress for Compiègne, her furs, shoes, hats, crinolines, costumes, robes de chambre, tea gowns, evening gowns. In the dark of the morning of our departure, we found a special breakfast of café au lait and a piece of toast with butter and cinnamon on it floating in the coffee. This was a rich surprise and lent the work of overseeing the packing of the trunks the feeling of both a holiday and a conspiracy. I and the other grisettes conducted it in an unusual, even solemn silence. While we could by no means be heard in the Empress's apartments, down in the dark cellar with her clothes, the task of preparing her for a month of gaiety was solemn all the same. We worked quietly, with as little conversation as possible. I'd never thought for a moment of what she looked like in the dresses, and now that I had seen her, little scenes cast themselves in my head of her. As I laid the dresses in tissue in their Louis Vuitton trunks, I thought, oh, this will look quite fun on her, or she will want to wear this with these, and so on. I had never felt this way before, to feel a small pleasure in it. I was not suspicious of it yet. Previously, I had been like the abbess of her furs, a solitary mission. Now, dressed in the green and gold uniform dress of the Autumn Palace, I kissed my friends in the basement goodbye and left, as if off for war. Her luggage we could see at the train station was by comparison to the Emperor's the greater. The cases were made for both of them by Louis Vuitton in embossed leather, the LV initials repeated in a field. Stacked in neat rows were hat boxes, shoe boxes, jewel boxes, the crates for the gowns. At the station, it was as if the Empress were secretly something enormous, disassembled in the morning dark, her various parts in the boxes and trunks we prepared and brought up to the surface. She was to be there for a month. Her lady guests each week were required to bring 28 distinct toilettes for their week there. No one could repeat a dress or gown in her presence during her stay. As Her Majesty required choices as to wear the one dress if one did not want to wear the one dress was a burden to her. That morning we departed for Compiègne with 200, each of them new. I stood near the Vuitton trunks while the cars were loaded, testing the feeling of my new uniform with my hands along my hips. The crowd around us seemed to communicate an automatic respect for me, as if I were a sans garde of the Emperor and not the Empress's grisette. The train gave its signal. Eugenie appeared then. A veil covered her face, falling down from the brim of a tweed cap, but she wore the diamond known as the Regent, a diamond the size of a sparrow. And in the sunlight coming through the station, it flashed so brightly, I almost expected there to be a sound. I wondered why she wore it, as it seemed dangerous to me. Watching her cross the station, I imagined a thief snatching it from her neck in a dash, or the clasp coming loose and the diamond rolling along the floor. But I saw the people around her looking on with pride at the flash of the Regent in the morning sun of the station. At the trunks, her careful procession, all heavily guarded. At me, waiting by the train. It was very much what they wanted of her. I thought of this as her own grade for these things, but that morning I understood it was also theirs. Her guards in a phalanx around her repeated, "L'Impératrice, l'Impératrice, l'Impératrice." And the men in the station doffed their hats and bowed. The women made half curtsies. As she approached the car of the train, I threw myself to the ground in my now customary way. "Vive l'Empereur, vive l'Impératrice, vive la France," shouted the men and women in the station. And then I felt her steps on the stairs, and with her safely inside, stood and made my way to my own car with the other servants, brushing the dirt from my skirt as they cheered, and the doors closed behind us. The palace at Compiègne was reached by traveling through the town, a stately, quiet thing on the edge of a gentle river. We were met by carriages that took us to the palace quickly, cutting past an enormous cathedral off of a rain-stained square, itself surrounded by cafes and shops. It was set off some from the town, but not as much as I had thought. The palace itself was cut of a stone the color of a bone, though not of ivory, but a bone found in the woods. The design of it was nearly plain by comparison to the Tuileries, and had some of the staid qualities from the outside of a library or a tax office, not quite the rich retreat I'd imagined. It was large, though, set off from the town by streets and a long park that extended into the imperial forests where the hunts would take place. Orderly rows of chestnut trees, their leaves turned to gold by the new cold and beginning to fall gently in the hard autumn sunlight, bordered the palace, bank of color high above the black iron fences with their gilt dragon's teeth that seemed to surround any place the emperor and empress were to stay the night. More than the Tuileries did, this place seemed prepared for some attack. Black cruel spikes feathered the walls and entrances. This palace's chamberlain stood in wait with pages in court dress and lines to either side of the entrance. The colors were the same as my own. They took no observable notice of me, though, which was its own kind of notice. If I looked wrong, only then would they have glanced at me directly, and then quickly unloaded the carriages and brought us in. I followed the luggage and the other ladies' maids and left the chamberlain to his observances with the Empress. The imperial apartments here were hung as well in the same red and gold of the Tuileries. As we entered, it was as if we'd taken the trains and cars all this way just to find ourselves back at home. In her dressing room, we waited for her, preparing for her first change from her traveling costume to her riding one. She wanted to go for a ride before the emperor arrived. A bell rang and we stood quickly while she walked in. The dressing room was circular. An enormous pendant chandelier hung above us, radiating an unearthly sparkling light. White silk hangings draped the walls and ceiling, so that it was like standing in a tent, if a very well-appointed one. She looked at us expectantly, but I hesitated as no one had briefed me on my duties, mistaking me, perhaps, for the girl that always came. I waited for a moment as she stood there expectantly, her arms aloft. The first girl glared at me, an eyebrow raised with contempt, and then made a yanking gesture with her arms. "You are the new girl," said the Empress quite suddenly. She said it in the Spanish accented French that would become familiar to me. I nodded, instantly blushing. This duty was once the duty of my ladies-in-waiting, but no longer, not since Marie Antoinette. The other grisette was blinking quickly, as if whatever the Empress said stung her eyes. "You used to dress my dummies at the Tuileries, yes?" I nodded again. "Treat me a little gentler than that," she said, and then she smiled softly. I hadn't thought she would speak to us. I imagined us beneath her, not worthy of her conversation. The earlier nascent affection I had felt for her budded, and while I let the other girl lead in taking her jewels, which I didn't know very well, much less how to handle them, I helped her with her riding costume, found her green velvet tri-cornered riding hat, and her coat with the Emperor's badge for his hunt. I set it on her head gently and pinned it into place, careful not to look at her eyes directly all the while. She left with a quick thank you, spoken to the walls, and only when she was gone did we relax our postures, at which point the anger in the other girl returned. "How stupid you are," she said. "You should have asked someone to tell you your duties." I nodded. We were walking swiftly now along the back passage. I was passing by dark mirrors, walking over ancient, creaking wooden floors. Here, as at the Tuileries, no one was going to tell me what they expected from me, and be sure to punish me for what I didn't know. What's more, my identity as a mute was not commonly known as it had been. Worse still, the impulse to speak rose up, to explain myself, to protest, as it had not in years, and I suppressed it with a panicked start, catching my breath, opening with my hand. While the Empress was away on her ride, we were given the tour of the palace by the Compiègne chamberlain and shown our quarters. I was to share a room at the back of the palace with my unhappy partner from earlier. The window had a view of the ditch and the wall and the kitchen entrance at the back. I hadn't understood the excitement in the other staff at leaving for the country, but as I unpacked in my small room, listening to the conversations taking place, I understood that as our wealthy charges exercised themselves, as they planned their musicales, tableaux vivants, operettas, hunts, and masked balls, we also plotted our own entertainments. Each week, to make sure the 100 guests had their fill, there would number sometimes nearly 900 of us between the attendant valets, ladies' maids, footmen, cooks, grisettes, and guards. Some of our company came and left with the guests, some were of the Tuileries, and some were of Compiègne. Subsequently, much the same as there was on the other side of the palace among the official guests, there would be affairs, singing and dancing, feasts, terrible fights, and feuds. And the separation was not by any means complete. There were guests whose tastes ran toward the servants, just as there were servants whose tastes ran toward the guests. The term for the gratuity, pourboire, usually exacted by the chamberlains from guests just prior to their departure, and which the chamberlains kept in large part for themselves, was also what you might say if you'd stumbled into and out of an apartment with a guest, and then titter, pourboire. If they were satisfied, they were absorbed entirely in their satisfaction, and they were not concerned with our whereabouts. And so we worked to their satisfaction in order to remain invisible and unheard and at play where possible. And in the shadow of their satisfaction, we set out our own. The bell for dinner rang, and we ran quickly from the room for our first meal. The song card at the Tuileries had told us of how the women the emperor had brought to him were asked to come to him naked. They left their elegant toilettes behind and were told that they could do anything with the emperor except kiss his mouth. I thought of this often, I found, now that I was around the empress so frequently. I wasn't allowed to meet her eyes unless she specifically asked me a question, and even then it made me nervous, and so I looked at her mouth. And when I did, I wondered who it was that kissed her, or if the emperor, if he saved this part of him for her alone. In the first week, I found I slept badly due in part to the hostility I bore my roommate, but what's more, I had very little patience for this new job. I was extremely uncomfortable to be so much in the imperial presence in the day, in the company of my fellow grisettes at night. A day bed in the hall was for me, or whoever it was on duty, to rest on as we waited for the inevitable bell. Outside the Empress's apartments was a secret passageway that led to the Emperor's library. The door hidden by a design to give the appearance of a shelf of books. While at first thrilling, it was hard to believe it would fool either the serious invader or the inserious one. And so the Emperor would never use us to call the Empress. I did not know why it was here. As I sat there the first week, I was bored, cross in a way that seemed new. The excited talk in the servant's car on the way here had me anxious, and now I wanted some kind of adventure, something forbidden, but also harmless. The guests had yet to arrive that morning, and so on the first morning of the first week, as we waited for the train from Paris to arrive and disgorge our guests that afternoon, after the Empress had left for another ride, I stood up from the daybed and pushed open the Emperor's library door. I had finally understood that this door was for servants. It was for me. The ceiling was painted with friezes of unfamiliar goddesses. I had a view out to the pale gravel yard, the garden and the forest beyond it. The chestnut trees' golden leaves, nearly ready to fall, took the light of the morning, glowing in their rows in the garden. The room's handsome wooden quiet terrified me. I immediately knew myself to be truly alone. The walls were so thick, nothing of the activity of the servants could be heard. I made my way back to my passageway, entering again the newly familiar back stairs and heading to where I knew I was to be expected, when I heard the terrible noise of someone moving, someone who had been at rest in the next room, and so I stood still, seizing up immediately. For a moment, the silence in response seemed to suggest I'd been successful, and then a high, soft piano note sounded, followed by others, chords. It was a slowly meandering, carefully beautiful piece of piano music, and as I was convinced somehow of being hidden for being still, I stayed and listened, deciding it would be safer to move once it was over. A nocturne is a piece of music that is said to have the qualities of night, usually written for piano and performed solo. They often don't sound right during the day. Listening to them then is sometimes confusing. This, though, was my first one. Written by Chopin, Opus 55, number 1, as I would eventually learn. It still sounds to me like someone walking through the dark, quietly searching for something loved and lost. And the morning light that day didn't undo this. The playing became louder briefly as he moved to the music's conclusion. From the pleasure I felt at listening to the music, I thought I was safe enough then to peer around the corner into the room beyond the library. As I didn't know how to open the secret door, I left it open. And besides, I was sure that this music had to require all of the attention of the person playing, certainly enough of it to keep them from noticing me. Checking to see the door behind me stayed open, I crept to the far entrance and peeked around the corner. A young man in a beautiful green velvet frock coat and tie, and the strange short white pants the imperial court found fashionable then, sat at a pianoforte, his legs gleaming. He was dark as if he spent considerable time in the sun. and had the sharp, handsome features of a Spaniard, all set off by the strict white of his clothes. The effect was nearly narcotic. He turned as if he knew and looked at me as Ira cooked over the top of the piano. He smiled as he continued to the piece's conclusion, which he let fade away gently, but he looked directly at me, and our eyes met. I stood still, unable to look away. When the music was gone, it was then I felt the entirety of my trespass. I quickly turned and left, curtsying as I went before anything could be said. Unknown to me then, he was both a pianist and a composer. He was young, handsome, reckless, enormously talented. He could stand while playing mazurkas on the piano and turn to face the crowd, continuing playing backwards while he smiled into the audience. It was ridiculous and thrilling to watch, and he didn't make mistakes. He had a young wolf's face, and his eyes looked hungry, his dark hair rising in curls. When he smiled, his huge teeth flashed. Shortly after arriving in Paris from Argentina, he was invited everywhere, including now the Autumn Palace. But it was unusual for him to be early and alone with a piano, left to himself in the music room off the Emperor's Library. There was a week for distinguished artist visitors, and it had not yet come. Later, when we knew each other, he would tell me he had been waiting for me to leave before playing, that he had sat down and hearing the door open, realized he was not alone. He was, at this time, accustomed to using the piano to get his way with women. Our rooms here were cold stone, none at all the warm stink of the Tuileries. I was sure the bed was smaller. Whenever I entered it, my eyes traced the walls as if I could push out the mortared stones with my gaze like a sorceress and command them to allow me to see the sky, to walk free to the fields, and whatever could lie beyond the edge of the forest. I shivered. The one advantage to dressing the Empress meant time spent in the warm rooms of her apartment. The ladies of the court still retained the privilege to enter her chambers at any time, even though their duties as her dressers had concluded. I found this unnerving. Princess d'Estling was the least intrusive, perhaps, and the Duchess de Bassano was the most. The widow Marat entered like a warm, matronly shadow, like the ghost of a mother, returned to give some comfort or advice. But Eugenie did not take advice from these women. Instead, they only gossiped. And with some shock, I saw they gossiped in English. From them I learned Louis Napoleon was never a very learned nor intelligent man, but this was not to be required of him either. He was descended from the first emperor, Napoleon, indirectly, the son of that emperor's brother. In the Prado in Spain, I once viewed the portraits there, painted of the Spanish Queen Isabel. She was a little girl seated in the portrait near her younger sister, who looked to be afraid of her. Isabel's expression looked as if she knew her sister feared her, and she relished it. When Henry IV acted to make himself King of France, it was her he was fighting. Royals never bred for intelligence, kindness, or wisdom. They have always bred for the quick sense of the main chance, the low cunning that has kept them alive and in power for centuries. Whenever someone reassures me with some gravity that the person I am about to meet is a real aristocrat, it fills me with terror. Louis Napoleon, with his terrible way of mixing up words, went into the Senate and declared himself emperor. The Senate had forgotten to make it illegal, especially as to their minds. He was so obviously stupid, it never occurred to them that they were in any danger. The now emperor handpicked the new Senate and had them sign loyalty oaths. The press was brought under his control. The professors and all the universities signed these oaths. The artists who offended his reign were prosecuted, and sometimes, in the case of Flaubert, against the emperor's own wishes. No printed word, no speech, no teachings, no entertainments, or to in any way endanger him. This is to say, whatever you could say of Louis Napoleon, he didn't love a good song, nor did he love a bad one. He had very little taste for music, and mostly only tolerated it. He went to the opera because he was the emperor, and it was an imperial entertainment, and so his opera had to be grand above all others, and it is very grand, but not for his great love of opera. There was no reason for there to be a consummate pianist and composer in the palace before the beginning of the series. I thought of the pianist. I thought of him as I sat idle before the guests were to arrive, wondering when I could steal out of the passageways again. It was only to see if I might see him again, of course, though I told myself I only still desired freedom. Why was he here, I wondered, but there was no one to ask. It was no business of mine. I let my eyes rise up to see the Empress as she examined herself in the mirror. She was sadly beautiful. In every portrait of her, her eyes have a kind of immortal melancholy, as if they contain in them a picture of some larger divine sadness. But there was also a fierce edge of pride which made it impossible to feel entirely sad for her. Also, there was something romantic to the way she prepared herself this day, something of the coquette. There was someone she anticipated, someone she wanted to have see her, in doing so, to be ruled by her. Not for her being Empress, though, but something else. The thought waited in my mind, and finally I allowed it. The pianist was here for her. Thank you.